Hey everybody, in between recording and posting the video that I released yesterday responding to Robert Gagnon, he posted another video to his TikTok account dedicated to responding to me. And this video is commenting on a topic that I said in my video yesterday he has never commented on. So in light of the fact that he released that video before I said I would not be responding to him anymore, I thought I would respond to that video in this video, and then we'll just end it.
Does the absence of an explicit prohibition of woman-female intercourse in Leviticus 18 and 20 mean that the authors would have had no problem with lesbianism? Old Testament scholar Dan McClellan thinks so, but is this Dogma Dan talking or Data Dan?
This is a pretty flagrant straw man. I did not say that the absence of any condemnation of female same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 demonstrates they would have had no problem with it. What I pointed out in my video is that you cannot interpret Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 to be universally condemning any and all homosexual practice, because it rather conspicuously omits female same-sex intercourse. And I point out that it likely has to do with the rationale for the condemnation of male same-sex intercourse. So there's a big difference between saying Leviticus 18 and 20 omit any condemnation of female same-sex intercourse and saying that the omission of female same-sex intercourse from Leviticus 18 and 20 means that they would have approved of female same-sex intercourse. I said the former. Gagnon is acting as if I said the latter, because it's a lot easier to demonstrate that that's not the case than it is to demonstrate that Leviticus 18 and 20 are condemning female same-sex intercourse. So this is a straw man. He has to attack a claim that I have not made so he can make it seem like he's actually got a plausible case against me. And it's only going to go downhill from here.
Dan McClellan thinks, along with a few other scholars, like Jacob Milgram, Saul Olyan, that ancient Israel did not have a problem with woman-female intercourse.
Again, this is a straw man. What we all note is that the legislation never condemns it. We have not concluded that that means they had no problem with it. What I have said in the past is that likely they didn't think it was as big a deal, precisely because of the rationales for condemning male same-sex intercourse. And as we're going to see toward the end of Gagnon's video, he actually agrees with me.
He complains about my reference to homosexual practice in connection with Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, in part because these prohibitions specifically reject only man-male intercourse. He says,
because he's using that one catch-all, and that is inaccurate when you're talking about a passage that conspicuously omits any reference to female same-sex intercourse, and then raises the issue of, wait a minute, they're referring to female bestiality right after they're referring to male same-sex intercourse, so they are cognizant of the role of women in different kinds of sexual acts. So why do they omit female same-sex intercourse? This may have something to do with their rationale for condemning male same-sex intercourse.
McClellan uses the absence of explicit mention of woman-female intercourse as a basis for denying.
And any and all homosexual practice is universally and eternally condemned. The text doesn't support that at all.
Is that the most likely interpretation of the data?
Yes, 100%. The condemnation of male same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18 and 20 does not constitute a condemnation of female same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, so you cannot point to Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 as a universal condemnation of all homosexual practice. That is, by far and away, the most likely interpretation of the data.
If not, then the conclusion is inescapable that McClellan is once more driven by dogma over data. I usually do refer to Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 as prohibitions of man-male intercourse, but I also sometimes speak of them as prohibitions of homosexual practice, because 4 lines of evidence strongly indicate that we should read the prohibitions of man-male intercourse as prohibitions of same-sex intercourse generally. The 4 lines of evidence are, number 1, the moral logic of the prohibitions of man-male sex. Number 2, the historical context of ancient Israel. Number 3, the later Greco-Roman view of lesbianism. And number 4, the history of interpretation of these prohibitions in early Judaism and Christianity. First, their moral logic. These prohibitions of man-male intercourse imply a prohibition of woman-female intercourse on the same principle by which man-male intercourse is forbidden. If it is wrong for a male to play the role of a female in an act of sexual intercourse with a man, then it would be wrong for a woman to play the sexual role of a man in an act of sexual intercourse with a female. For God created woman as the sexual counterpart to a man, not to another woman.
So, as I pointed out in my previous video, what Gagnon likes to do is impose generalizing and unifying logical frameworks onto these questions to try to extrapolate more general principles from these specific pieces of legislation. So here the idea is, because it's wrong for a male to have intercourse with another male, it must therefore be wrong for a female to have intercourse with another female. There is parity, there is reciprocity. What is wrong for the man must be wrong for the woman because they are sexual counterparts to each other. And of course, there's a reason that male same-sex intercourse is being condemned, and Gagnon is going to acknowledge that reason later on in this video. And it's because men are at the pinnacle of the hierarchy of domination that became socially conventionalized in ancient West Asia. And so for a male to be sexually penetrated violated their position in that hierarchy. So is there reciprocity there? If it's inappropriate for a man to be sexually penetrated, does that mean their sexual counterpart cannot be sexually penetrated? Of course not, because they're not on equal footing. The man is the superior in the sexual relationship. He's the only active sexual agent. The woman is not an active sexual agent. They are a passive sexual partner. So the rights, the responsibilities, the duties, the limitations on the man's sexual activity are far different from the rights, the duties, the expectations, the limits on the woman's sexual activity. So the notion that what's wrong for a man is therefore wrong for a woman because there is complete reciprocity and parity and they are counterparts to each other, and so A equals B, therefore B equals A, is falsified. Not only because they're not equals, but because we have in the Bible quite clear indications that men have vastly distinct responsibilities, duties, rights, expectations, limits to their sexual activity. So as he does generally, Gagnon is just imposing a generalizing, unifying, logical framework on the text in order to get it to say what it doesn't say, in order to twist it so that it can be made to say what Gagnon wants it to say, despite the fact that it does not say that.
Second, the historical context of ancient Israel indicates an implicit rejection of lesbianism. For example, Deuteronomy 22:5 states, quote, "A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is an abomination, toavah, to Yahweh your God." Think about it. If a woman wearing man's clothing is an abomination to Yahweh, how much more a woman who plays the role of a man in sexual intercourse?
But female same-sex intercourse does not necessarily require a woman playing the role of a man. And this was actually one of the reasons in the Greco-Roman world that they mocked and derided female same-sex intercourse. They referred to them pejoratively with a term that meant to rub, because they could not sexually penetrate each other. They could not play the role of a man. Again, we're imposing, generalizing, and unifying logical frameworks on the text in order to overrule what's actually in the text, so that Gagnon can read into the text what he wants to find in the text. And he has to wildly misrepresent my position in the process.
Third, the later Greco-Roman view of lesbianism confirms the supposition of ancient Israelite rejection of woman-female intercourse. The Greek and Roman world rejected lesbianism nearly universally, far more widely than they rejected male homosexual practice. For those in the Greco-Roman world who embraced male homosexual practice, the reason was because the dominant role that it gave the woman on top. For those who did not embrace male homosexual practice, it was another example of how same-sex relationships was not an anatomical or procreative fit.
So the positions manifested in the later Greco-Roman world obviously have no relevance to reconstructing the view behind Leviticus 18 and 20. They are not yet influenced by Greco-Roman social convention and philosophical convention. So you can't retroject back into the past the influence of a culture that was absent from the composition and the worldview of Leviticus 18 and 20. So obviously that's not relevant.
Fourth, the history of interpretation of the Levitical prohibitions of man-male intercourse suggests rejection of lesbianism.
So once again, Gagnon is taking later interpretations that have fallen under the influence of Greco-Roman social convention and philosophical convention, and he's trying to retroject it back onto Leviticus 18 and 20 to say, well, these interpretations must have been consistent throughout. They must have began exactly as they were when they were being expressed within the context of the Greco-Roman world, and that does not follow. Now, this is not to say that I think that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 would have been A-OK with female same-sex intercourse. I don't think that. I think they probably would have rejected it as well, although not as forcefully. They probably would not have imposed the death penalty. They probably omitted it precisely because they didn't think it was that big a deal, but had they been asked, they probably would have said, we're again it. But that's not the question that Gagnon is addressing here. And my concern is not being addressed here. Gagnon is addressing this straw man, where he has suggested that because I have said that you cannot interpret Leviticus 18 and 20 to be universally condemning any and all homosexual practice because it conspicuously omits female same-sex intercourse, well, that must be the same as saying that they must have endorsed it. Again, Gagnon imposing the generalizing and unifying logical frameworks in order to get what he wants out of the argument. But this is like saying that because the prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was guilty, the prosecution has therefore proved he is innocent. But that's not the case. And that's why juries don't find people innocent. They just find them not guilty, meaning they have not been proven to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Gagnon knows the difference between these two things, but is just ignoring the difference because he needs to in order to make it sound like he's got even a plausible case.
Paul includes an indictment of lesbianism in Romans 1:26, alongside an indictment of male homosexual practice in Romans 1:27.
And his position is also clearly irrelevant to understanding what Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 are actually prohibiting. But additionally, what else has fallen out of favor between Leviticus 18 and 20 and Paul, and largely as a result of the influence of the Greco-Roman world? Polygamy. That's another thing that has changed. Let's look at how Jewish authors in Greco-Roman period Judaism interpret the approbation and the endorsement of polygamy in the Hebrew Bible. They're against it. And that's not because they were against it all along, all the way back to the composition of those texts. It's because things change, interpretations change, values change, sexual ethics change.
He clearly sees a correlation between males having sex with males and females having sex with females. His statement, quote, even their females, underscores how deep the rot is in contemporary Greco-Roman society, when even females have debased themselves by engaging in same-sex intercourse, treating their sex as only half intact in relation to their own sex rather than the other sex. It's a good thing that we have Romans 1:26. Otherwise, McClellan would be saying, look, Paul used only the term arsenokoitai, men lying with a male, in 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10.
No, I wouldn't so naively attribute authorship of the pastoral epistles to Paul.
So he must have no problem with lesbianism.
No, again, this is a case of Gagnon saying, because I am pointing out that the jury did not find the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty, I must therefore be concluding that the prosecution proved the defendant to be innocent. I wouldn't say Paul must have had no problem with lesbianism, but if we did not have Romans 1, I would say Paul doesn't condemn female same-sex intercourse. Gagnon knows the difference between saying Paul doesn't condemn, which is an observation, of an empirical fact in the absence of Romans 1, versus Paul had no problem with. Gagnon knows the difference. He is not an unintelligent man. He is just eliding the difference and acting as if I have done something wrong because he's trying to perform confidence, conviction, and competence for an audience who already agrees with him, does not know these data as well as he does, and just needs to be convinced that they are justified in their agreement. This is just a little rhetorical puppet show for people who don't know the data all that well and can't think that critically.
The Church Fathers also viewed female-female intercourse as sin.
Now, I'm going to skip over his citation of a number of texts from the early first millennium CE because, again, they're entirely irrelevant to what the authors and editors of Leviticus 18 and 20 were communicating versus what they omitted.
McClellan argued that if the authors of Leviticus 18 had thought that intercourse between females was sin, they would have mentioned it, because
they're referring to female bestiality right after they're referring to male same-sex intercourse. So they are cognizant of the role of women in different kinds of sexual acts.
Well, that's bad reasoning, Dan, as our 4 lines of evidence indicate.
Because I never said that. This is, again, an argument being put into my mouth by Gagnon as a straw man. I didn't say they obviously didn't think it was sin. What I said is that it's not in there. And in other places, in print and on social media where I've talked about this, I have said that they probably didn't think it was as big a deal, but they probably still wouldn't have been okay with it. So Gagnon has to misrepresent me to make it sound like he has an even semi-plausible case to make.
Rather, there are multiple better explanations for why there is no mention of woman-female sex after man-male sex. The most obvious reason why woman-female sex is not explicitly mentioned, but female-animal sex is that woman-female intercourse did not involve penetration or transfer of semen, whereas sex between a woman and male animal, they believed, could entail such. Moreover, lesbian sex may have been viewed as a less severe offense than man-male intercourse, precisely because of the absence of penetration as the primary definer of sexual intercourse, thus an evil, but not meriting the gravest penalty of capital sentencing. In addition, a society that is dominated by men and with a high view of female chastity that tightly controlled female lives, woman-female intercourse was not a significant concern.
And this is precisely the argument that I have made elsewhere, that they didn't think it was as big a deal, and because it doesn't involve penetration, there's no one taking the male role. As Gagnon said earlier, they obviously would have understood female same-sex intercourse to entail, and therefore would have condemned on the same grounds as their condemnation of male same-sex intercourse. So Gagnon here is not only agreeing with the position that I have expressed elsewhere, he's arguing directly against himself.
Note that same-sex female intercourse goes completely unmentioned in other legal materials from the ancient Near East, and that there are no female homosexual cult prostitutes in the ancient Near East generally, or Israel in particular. We do hear of male homosexual cult prostitutes, both in the ancient Near East and in periods of heretical rule in Judah and Israel. Indeed, a woman's proximity to males would have generated more controls and watchfulness than her proximity to animals on a farm.
This is exactly what I have pointed out elsewhere, that men were the only active sexual agents, and so that's why they're the ones whose sexual activity is so closely monitored. And as I have pointed out, there's a reason that Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 only contain one prohibition on a sexual partner that a woman may choose. And it's no coincidence that that is the one sexual partner that could actually be lower than a woman on the socially conventionalized hierarchy of domination, and that's an animal. Gagnon is agreeing with the position as I have fleshed it out in many other places, and is directly arguing against himself because he has straw-manned my argument and is misrepresenting what my concern is.
In short, the claim that woman-female intercourse would have been acceptable in ancient Israel is a far less credible interpretation of the data than the view that the condemnation of such behavior is implicit in the condemnation of man-male intercourse.
Once again, that's not my argument. That's the pretend argument that Gagnon has ginned up as a straw man so he can sound like he has something intelligent to say. But also the notion that female same-sex intercourse is implicit in Leviticus 18 and 20 is not true. If the question were, how can we best reconstruct comprehensively the sexual ethic of the authors of Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, then we could answer that they likely would have had a problem with female same-sex intercourse, but likely not as severe a problem as they did with male same-sex intercourse. But that's not the question. The question is, what does Leviticus 18 and 20 condemn? It does not condemn female same-sex intercourse, whatever their actual position on that.
This once again demonstrates McClellan's preference for LGBTQ dogma over biblical data. Looks like Dogma Dan once again showed up instead of Data Dan.
Looks like a D+ student at best showed up to my class and pretended to be the professor. This is why I shan't be engaging Gagnon anymore. He does not engage in good faith. He does not actually engage my actual concerns. He uses straw men. He argues against himself unwittingly because of those straw men, and he doesn't represent the actual critical views. He represents whatever arguments will get him from point A to point B, because point B is the priority. His priority is not understanding these texts on their own terms. His priority is defending his dogmas, and his dogmas are hateful and harmful. And as I pointed out in the last video, literally result in children taking their own lives because he has literally said that their sexuality is broken. Again, that is abominable rhetoric. Gagnon needs to grow the hell up. All these videos are doing is performing confidence and conviction and competence for an audience that already agrees with his dogmas and just wants to be made to feel justified in that agreement. And that's why it is useless to try to reason with Gagnon. He will not be reasoned with, neither will that dogmatic audience of his. And the fit for this video has been Power Man.